This is the Olympus M.Zuiko 14-42mm F3.5 to F5.6 Mark II R. Its model number is EZ-M1442-2 R. It was announced in June 2011 and it weighs 113 grams. Its length when retracted is 5 centimeters, so that's 5 centimeters from the body of the camera to the top of the lens, without the lens hood obviously. So from there to there. So the part which goes inside the camera doesn't actually count towards the length of the lens. It comes with a decoration ring, which I've taken off here, and the model number for that is Olympus DR-40. And it does have a lens hood thread, so once you take off the decoration ring, you can attach a lens hood to it. And the model number for the lens hood is Olympus LH-40. So the lens hood should give a little bit better protection against side lights entering the lens. The lens cap for it is called LC-37B, so there's no automatic lens cap for it, whereas there's a similar lens to this which has an automatic lens cap, so that's not the case for this lens. Its filter thread is 37mm, if you can see that there. It has a maximum aperture of f3.5, which varies to f5.6 depending on where in the zoom range you're in. And the minimum aperture for the lens is f22. It has 7 aperture blades, so should have decent background blur and bokeh on this. The diagonal angle of view of this lens is 75 degrees at the widest end and 29 degrees at the narrowest. The closest focusing distance is 25 centimeters at the widest and 30 centimeters at the narrowest. It does have a focus ring, as you can see here that I'm moving, and it also has a manual zoom ring there. So before you can use this lens, you need to move this button here, this lock, unlock it, and then extend the lens, and then it clicks into place, and then you can zoom in or out. So prior to doing this, you can't use the lens and you can't use the zoom ring. So every time you turn on your camera, you want to use this lens, you have to unlock the lever, push the lens out, and then you can start using it. So this is the manual or mechanical zoom ring that you can use. The only disadvantage I would say for this lens is that it's not wide enough. I prefer it to be a little bit wider for these type of lenses. And the other thing is that it's not as sharp as the Olympus M.Zuiko Pro 12-45 f4. So I find those Olympus M.Zuiko Pro series lenses to be a lot sharper than these normal M.Zuiko lenses. But there's a trade-off in terms of price as well as the size and weight that you have to make in order to use the Olympus M.Zuiko Pro lenses. One more disadvantage about this lens is that the friction on the zoom ring is not uniform across the full focal length. So at some points in the focal range it's tighter and at other places the friction is less. So that's something which I find quite difficult to work with if I want to zoom in or out quickly when I'm recording video. If you're doing photography, then it doesn't matter that much. But if you're doing video recording and the friction of the zoom ring changes depending on where in the focal length you are, then that's a bit of a problem because you won't get that smooth zooming in or zooming out action that you want. And I think the reasoning for that is because they try to make this lens really small, so at some point when you're zooming in or out, it goes back in and then it changes the direction that it moves. And I think it's that point which the tension or the friction changes. So just keep that in mind if you're buying this with the intention to use zooming in and out during video recording, then it's probably not the best lens to use. And you should probably go for something like the M.Zuiko Pro 12-45 instead. It's obviously more expensive and bigger and heavier, but it's substantially better both in terms of image quality as well as the zoom ring, smoothness or constant friction. And the main advantages of this lens is that it's really small and really light, so it's quite convenient to have this lens on a camera and use it whenever you want to. So if we compare this lens to the 14-42mm F3.5-5.6 electronic zoom, which is effectively almost identical to this lens. So this is the pancake version of this lens and it has a few differences which I'll go over. So the electronic zoom one weighs 93 grams, so it's marginally lighter than this one, which weighs 113 grams. And its length is 2.25 centimeters, whereas this one is 5 centimeters, both of them when they're retracted. And this one has an automatic lens cap, so if I turn on the camera, the lens extends out and it's a mechanical force which unblocks the lens, so it removes the lens cap. And then if I switch off the camera, the lens retracts and the lens cap is closed automatically. So that's something that this lens doesn't have, so you have to manually take off the lens cap. But in addition to that, another thing that this lens has is that you have to unlock it here every time you want to use it. So you unlock it and extend the lens. So it's locked here, and what I would need to do is unlock it and then extend the lens, then it falls into place. So every time I want to use this lens, I have to take off the lens cap manually, which I've taken off already, and unlock it and extend it before I can use this lens, whereas this is not the case with this one. So in terms of ease of use, the electronic zoom one is obviously easier to use because you just turn on the camera and start taking pictures or videos. Whereas with this one, you have to take off the lens cap, unlock it, extend the lens, and then you can start taking pictures or film videos. The pancake lens has 5 aperture blades, whereas this lens has 7 aperture blades. So that means the one with the 7 aperture blades will provide a nicer background blur and more round bokeh, whereas this one, the bokeh might be a little bit more edgy, so it will be less circular. The closest focusing distance on the pancake lens is 20 centimeters at the widest, whereas on this one is 25 centimeters at the widest, and then at the telephoto end, or the narrowest, is 25 centimeters on the electronic zoom pancake lens, whereas on this one is 30 centimeters. So this one has an electronic zoom ring, which is not actually a real ring, it's more like a spring. So it feels like a spring. You push it in one direction and it zooms in, and you push it in the other direction and it zooms out. So you can't actually rotate this, you just push it in one direction or the opposite direction. But it's nevertheless a ring, even though it doesn't turn. Whereas with this one, it doesn't actually have an electronic ring. It has a manual mechanical ring for zooming in and out. And as I mentioned, it's not consistent, but if you're doing video recording, then obviously having a mechanical ring for zooming in and out is more useful than having an electronic zoom ring, which also feels like a spring. And also this one has a focus ring, which is wider and easier to turn, whereas the focus ring on this one is really narrow. So in terms of video work, whether it's the background blur or the zoom ring or the focus ring, this lens is better. But if you want to use it as a remote PTZ lens, or if you just want something light and small and easy to use, then the electronic zoom one is better, because you just take it out, turn on the camera, the lens cap is already open, and you just start taking pictures. And you have obviously a nice functionality for the PTZ as well, because you can zoom in and zoom out electronically, which you can't do with this one remotely. One of the disadvantages of the electronic zoom lens is that it doesn't have a lens hood thread, whereas with this one, it has both a filter thread and a lens hood thread. So you can have a filter on the camera, and it's 37 millimeters if I remember correctly, if you can see that there. And then you have the lens hood thread as well on the outside. So you can have both a filter attached and a lens hood. Whereas on this one, you just have the filter thread and I've attached the automatic lens cap on it. So you can maybe have a third-party lens hood attached to the filter thread here, but I wouldn't recommend that because it would make it front heavy, and since it's an electronic zoom lens and it opens up automatically and closes, you don't want anything heavy on there, so you want the lightest thing which you can get. I think the best use case for the filter thread is to have this automatic lens cap, because it makes it so easy to use this lens and just start shooting. Another comparison to this lens is the Panasonic Lumix 14-42mm F3.5-5.6 power zoom lens, which also has optical image stabilization or optical stabilization as part of the lens. And that one weighs 95 grams, so it's slightly lighter than this one. I don't have that lens, so I can't show it to you, but that lens is 95 grams, so it's marginally lighter than this one. And in terms of thickness, it's also smaller, because that one is considered a pancake lens, so it's 2.68 centimeters, whereas this one is 5 centimeters. And they both have the same maximum aperture at 3.5. And the closest focusing distance on the Lumix lens is 20 centimeters, whereas it's 25 centimeters on this lens. And they both have a filter thread of 37 millimeters. The Panasonic Lumix lens doesn't have a focus ring, so it has a focus lever instead. So if you're doing video recording, that's more difficult to use. And on that lens, it doesn't also have a zoom ring, so what it has instead is an electronic zoom lever. So again, you're zooming in and out with a lever, whereas on this one you have a mechanical zoom ring which you can rotate to zoom in and out. So for video work, I would say this one is definitely better than both the Panasonic Lumix and the Olympus M.Zuiko 14-42 F3.5-5.6, and both of those lenses have electronic zoom or power zoom as Panasonic calls it. So those lenses, I would say they're better for use with a PTZ setup. So if you want to manage them remotely, whereas if you're doing video recording on a camera, I think this one is much better. So you have filter thread, you have lens hood thread, you have a proper focus ring and a proper mechanical zoom ring. So those are big advantages for video recording in my opinion. Now one more comparison is the Panasonic Lumix 12mm to 32mm F3.5-5.6 pancake lens, and that one weighs only 70 grams, whereas this one weighs 113 grams, and that one has a thickness of 2.4 centimeters, whereas this one is 5 centimeters when retracted. They both have the same maximum aperture, but the Lumix one has a closest focusing distance of 20 centimeters, whereas this one has a closest focusing distance of 25 centimeters. They both have the same filter thread size at 37 millimeters, and both of them have a manual or mechanical zoom ring. So that's one of the interesting things about that Panasonic pancake lens, that it does have a mechanical zoom ring, but that one doesn't have a focus ring. So you have to use a slider on the camera. So not only does it not have a focus ring, but it doesn't even have a focus lever or anything on the lens to pull focus. So if you want to do focus on that lens, you have to do the focus in the camera or just switch on autofocus. And even though that lens does have optical stabilization, the optical stabilization will only work on Panasonic cameras, and it can be configured from within the camera. So there's no on-off switch on the lens itself to switch it on and off. I would say the advantages of the Lumix 12mm to 32mm lens is that it's slightly sharper than this one, and aside from being slightly sharper, the widest focal length is 12mm, whereas on this one is 14mm. So I think for video recording, a lot of the time 12mm would make a difference, whereas in photography, even if it's 14mm, you can adjust yourself to take the picture, whereas with video work you have less control over the environment that you're in, and that 12mm can sometimes make a big difference in the video that you're recording. But again, it depends on your use case and how you're using the lens. But I think if you're going for one of those lenses, then you have to choose what's more important to you, the wide angle 12mm aspect and the better image quality, or whether you want something like this for better video recording with a bigger focus ring, bigger zoom ring, 7 aperture blades, filter thread, lens hood thread, or whether the pancake style of lenses are more suitable for your case. So you want something, for example, that opens up easily, like the automatic lens that you have on the Olympus one, or one of the Panasonic 12mm, which is wider than the other lenses. So those are things to consider. I will just mention one more lens, even though this is not a reasonable comparison. I will mention the 12-45 M.Zuiko Pro lens, because I think the image quality of this lens is so much better that even though it's more expensive and bigger and heavier, it's worth actually going for the M.Zuiko Pro lens as opposed to any of these small pancake lenses. Obviously it depends on how you want to use the lens and whether you want to have a small lens, but if you're willing to go to a bigger size and bigger weight, the M.Zuiko Pro 12-45 really delivers much sharper and better images, and it has a constant aperture of f4 as well, so you have that through zooming in and out regardless. Anyway, let me know if you have any questions about this lens, or if you want me to compare it to any other lens or provide sample footage.